Welcome to Web3 with a16z. Today we're running a special episode about the intersection of AI and crypto. Our guests are a16z Crypto founder and managing partner Chris Dixon and a16z Growth General Partner David George. They discuss the broken economics of the internet, new models for creative people, how to think through the first, second, and third order effects of big platform shifts, and more. Today's episode is a crossover from a16z's AI Revolution Conversation series, and it's especially timely as the paperback edition of Chris Dixon's best-selling book, Read, Write, Own, goes to print. Check out the show notes for links to those and more. As a reminder, none of the content should be taken as tax, business, legal, or investment advice. Please see a16z.com/disclosures for more important information, including a link to a list of our investments.
Chris, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'll always love hanging out with you. Obviously, you spend most of your time in crypto today. How do you generally see crypto and AI interacting?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, first of all, my kind of meta view is that you have the technology waves tend to come in pairs or triples. Like the last kind of 15 years ago, it was cloud, mobile social cloud. Mm-hmm. And I think they tend to, I'm always sort of giving this speech to entrepreneurs, they tend to reinforce each other. And so, mobile was, what took computing from hundreds of millions to billions of people. Social was kind of the killer app that hooked them. And cloud was the infrastructure that made it possible, right? And so you couldn't really have, all three of them. And I remember being back then, people having debates, which were better. It turned out they were all better.
They were all required. Yeah.
They're all required. And so I think of that with AI, crypto, and maybe, new devices, the other kind of probably robotics and self-driving cars and VR and things. I think of those as kind of the three interesting things going on. And I think they all kind of complement each other and work together. So crypto's this is what my book's about, is it's a new way to architect internet services, a new way to build networks that has a bunch of different properties, which I argue are beneficial for a bunch of reasons and can do a set of things you couldn't do before, essentially. Right. And so, first of all, that's what it is, because I think a lot of people don't, they think of it as Bitcoin or meme coins or something. And so that's fundamentally not what it is to me, or I think to the kind of smart people working in the space. There's many different ways in which it intersects with AI. So the first way, which is something we've invested a bunch in, is just using this new architecture to build AI systems. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, one of the kind of core questions I think we've just talked a lot at this firm about the future of AI is to what extent will AI be controlled by a small set of companies or controlled by a broad community? The obvious first question there is it open source?
Yes.
It's kind of negatively shocked me how closed source the AI world has become. 10 years ago, everything was open and put in papers, and then it all kind of shut down and was, closed. And they said this was for safety reasons. I think it just happened to be very good for their
I just think it's
defensibility.
Beneficial business reasons.
I don't believe the safety thing. But thankfully there's these ones like Llama and Flux and Mistral and things who are open source. I worry that's a little fragile because, first of all, I don't know, a lot of them don't put their weights open. Is it really open? Like, some of it's open, like the data pipeline's not open. Is it really reproducible? They could switch it tomorrow. These models get better every month. And if they don't start doing the new frontier, I don't know. So it's like,
it's very heavily dependent on one large company.
Yeah. It's not like anyways. So, so one of the things we've invested in is a sort of stack of internet services that are built for the AI stack, but open services at different layers. So as an example, there's a project called Jensen, which is building, think of it as sort of a crowdsourced compute layer. Yep. And so you as a startup can submit a job that, goes beyond the compute you control, and it goes out to a network, kind of Airbnb style, of people that have excess compute, and the network manages that supply and demand, right?
And that's the economic ledger.
Yeah, that's one example. Another one is one called Story Protocol, which is a new way to think about registering intellectual property. And so you can create image or video or piece of music, and then you register it on a blockchain, which keeps a record of the piece of media and the rights around it. It uses existing copyright law. So the blockchain record mirrors a legal agreement that's been crafted to work internationally. Mm-hmm. And then anyone can come along, and as long as they abide by your terms that you set, you might say something like, you can use this, you can remix it, you can create derivative works, but you have to, any revenue you make, you have to pay me 10% or whatever.
Yeah.
you set the terms, but that creates this sort of open marketplace where anyone right now you have to call up some company and try to do a BD deal and this and that, and so you end up having this kind of thing where people either basically steal it or don't do it, or they're scaled enough to make a deal or something. Like you have OpenAI going to Shutterstock and they paid him $100 million, but this is really just for the very high end companies. This is creating a broad democratic kind of resource where anyone a small creator can set the terms. And then ideally what you create is kind of this, and this is what a lot of a recurring theme in the blockchain world is, you have this kind of what we call composability. I have a chapter in the book on this, which is a very powerful force. I think the kind of core force behind the success of open source software. I mean, people forget this, but open source software is probably the most successful, certainly the most successful open computing movement in the last 80 years. But when Linux went from like 0% market share in the 90s to probably, I don't know what, 90+% market share today. And a lot of that's because of what we call composability, which is it's basically this all these different people coming along and contributing little pieces to the system, and the system collectively getting much better in the same way that Wikipedia is sort of a collective knowledge system. And so something like Story Protocol, you get the same kind of Lego brick effect with media. So someone comes along and they create a character, someone else creates another character, someone else remixes them, someone else, and then you get this kind of, you can use whatever AI tool, you can create generative AI, and you can create, your story, you can create your, I create a new superhero universe where I use these other Lego bricks, and as long as the money kind of waterfalls back, that's all okay.
Yeah, so the incentives are aligned because the money waterfalls back.
So I think it's a really great vision that both allows for people to embrace these new tools, but also provides an economic model for creative people. I think for me, that's a recurring theme in our investing, is like, what will be the economic models for creative people in an AI world? Don't stop the inevitable, which is the technology progressing. Lean into it and sort of rethink those models. That to me is the most exciting area for this intersection.
You go from social networking companies, which keep 100% of revenue for themselves when creators create stuff effectively, to something where, like, hopefully the creator can capture an upfront amount that they set. And then ideally the composability allows for actually more creativity built on top.
That's right.
Because of the economic incentive alignment.
Yeah. We're seeing people do interesting stuff with kind of crowdsourced model evaluation. So that's, what you see, just think of it as all the data side of things. Like you need more data. Well, and we have this crypto as a breakthrough in new ways to design incentive systems. And so you combine that and you say, well, how can you use new incentive systems to get more data for these AI systems, right? Data can either be an input or it can be a model evaluation or whatever it might be. So it's kind of what these companies like Scale AI do, but in a crowdsourced way instead of a centralized way. There's a project that's co-founded by Sam Altman that we're investors in called WorldCoin, where they're trying to do the thesis is that in a world where AI can replicate humans and content, we need a way to prove you're human, right? And the best way to prove you're human is cryptographically using a blockchain. And so the idea is they have an incentive system to get people to sign up, and originally it was this orb that scanned your eyeballs that people. Some people, it was more controversial. They now have systems where you can identify yourself in other ways, including your passport and other things. But the idea is you prove who you are, you get cryptographic proof of that on a blockchain, and then you can use that for a bunch of different services. Think of a very simple example is think of CAPTCHAs. Today you have to go and, play these puzzles, which I think have gotten so complicated and probably
not AI proof anymore.
I don't think they're AI proof anymore, and they may be human proof. I have trouble with a lot of them, but replace those with instead of systems like that and other kinds of clunky fraud systems have an actual cryptographic thing. So I have a code essentially. This is how cryptography works, and that code proves that I'm a human, and then you can layer onto that other kinds of things you prove on top. So that's another example of an interesting kind of intersection. So I think there's a bunch. So there's sort of the infrastructure layer of like take AI systems that exist today in a centralized way and decentralize them both in terms of code and services. Mm-hmm. There's new things you couldn't do before, like machine-to-machine payments. And then there's these sort of really far-off things that I find the most exciting, which are like, what are new business models in this world, like for creative people as an example.
Yeah. One of the things that you pointed out to me kind of right after the ChatGPT moment is you're like, hey, we have the potential for sort of a break in the pact of the internet.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think is a super fascinating.
Yeah. And there's a chapter on this in the book toward the end. I call it a new covenant. So like you think about the incentive system. One of the main reasons the internet succeeded is it had a very clever incentive system, right? Like how do you get 5 billion people to sort of opt into the system? without having a central authority tell them to, right? Like this is because of the incentives of the internet. And specifically, there's been a kind of what's emerged over the last 20-ish years I call it an economic covenant between the kind of the platforms, specifically social networks and search engines, and all the people that create websites that essentially those link to, right?
Exactly.
And so if you're a travel website or a recipe website or an artist who has illustrations, there's an implicit covenant you have, let's say with Google, right? Which is you say to Google, it's okay if you crawl my content and you index me and you show snippets in your search engine if you send me traffic back. Right?
Yeah.
This is how the internet has evolved, right? And why do you want traffic back? Because you have some business model. Maybe it's a free site, maybe it's an ad-based site, maybe it's a subscription-based site, but whatever it is, somehow you have a way to make money on traffic. There's an understanding, right?
Mm. And it's mutually beneficial.
Mutually beneficial, and occasionally that covenant has been breached. So there was a thing Google does called one boxing, which is they would take your content and just put it. Like I was on the board of Stack Overflow for a long time, and they would do this where they would take you type in a thing for Stack Overflow, instead of clicking on it, they would just show you the answer and remove the click. They've done that with Wikipedia. They did it with lyric sites.
Yeah, but they did with Yelp. They did.
Yeah, and people get very upset. Or they with Yelp, they promote their own content on top, and so there were issues, but it kind of worked, right? Now the question in an AI world, right, is if you have these chatbots that just give you if you go and you say I want an illustration and it just generates an illustration, or you say I want a recipe and it gives you a recipe. This might be a better user experience, by the way. I'm not against it. I think it's probably better in the end for the users of the internet. But the problem is it breaks the covenant, right? They took this data that, these systems were trained on data that was put on the internet under the prior covenant.
Under the premise that they're going to get traffic back.
That's right.
And they can monetize
That's
it correctly.
Right. And that was the premise. And that was sort of the promise, right?
Yeah.
And now you have a new system which may not send the traffic. In fact, it probably won't. If these things can just tell you the answer, why would you kind of click through? And so that's probably where we're headed, is a world where you have sort of 5 big systems, let's call it, 3 to 5 big AI systems. You go to their websites, they give you an answer. And you don't. And so what happens to the billion other websites if they aren't getting traffic is the question, right? And so that's the kind of question I think that I talk about with. So, and I'm surprised / disappointed that I don't see anyone. I feel like I'm the only person I've ever seen talking about this.
Yeah,
I feel like I'm screaming the abyss. Like I'm a little bit surprised that the AI people who it's fine. Like they took all the data and there'll be copyright lawsuits, and I'm not going to opine on that.
And they've done some data deals
like,
in there.
But like, aren't we a little bit like, even forgetting about the societal questions, like, and all the small businesses that will be like, don't we worry about the internet? Because I worry about just the internet.
Well,
like if you have an internet of 5, companies, and there's just it becomes like TV in the broadcast TV in the 1970s. There's 4 channels. Like, is that the world we want to live in? Is that a world that's pro startup, pro innovation, pro creativity?
Like a long tail of websites, like that next generation of long tail websites.
Yeah. How do you break out? How do you create new things? So I don't know. So I just worry without thinking it through. And so to me, look, and I'm not saying that I have the only answer to it, or you have to be a crypto answer. I realize for some people that's controversial, but I think at step 1 is we should say, okay, wait, this breaks all the incentives of the internet. And step 2 is, is that a good thing? I don't think so. And then, so what is the right answer? And should we create new incentives? And this is why, like, a lot of what I've been trying to invest in and think about has been, okay, like the example I gave with Story Protocol is like, let's think about new incentive systems to layer on top. Right?
Yeah. One of the things you've talked about is just this trifecta of, technology, products that have come along at the same time. So generative AI, crypto, and new hardware platforms. So how do you think about the 3 of those coming together?
So yeah, and the analogy, of course, is like mobile social cloud, where the last wave, where they all kind of ended up reinforcing each other. I mean, you're already seeing some of this. You have these new, devices, the AR and VR glasses and things, which use a lot of AI. And the sort of her style kind of stuff, self-driving cars. You have Tesla and a bunch of other companies doing, humanoid robotics.
Yeah.
I think that's probably just barely scratching the surface now of like kind of real world AI, putting stuff out in the world and having interact, and that's very powerful. And sort of unlocks a whole new avenue of interesting applications. On the crypto side, I think. There's a bunch of interesting stuff. There's a whole area of crypto I'm excited about called DePIN, which is decentralized physical infrastructure. And so the idea is a lot of physical. So the kind of the most prominent example is a project called Helium, and Helium is a community-owned, crowdsourced telecom network that tries to compete with Verizon and AT&T. And so basically what they did is they created an incentive system where anyone can put a Helium node up in their house, and that adds a little bit to the network. It's a wireless transmitter. And they got hundreds of thousands of people in the country to put these networks up. And now they offer a cellular service that's, I think, significantly cheaper than something you get from Verizon. It's like $20 a month instead of $70 a month. And it's cheaper because much of the time it's using this homegrown network. They didn't have to spend tens of billions of dollars to build it out, right? Yeah. But what's interesting about it is they use the crypto. Crypto is very good at creating incentive systems.
Right.
And traditionally in networks, the hardest part of a network is the bootstrap phase.
Right.
So once a network has kind of critical mass, it's clearly valuable. Once I can sign up for the cellular network and use it anywhere in the country, clearly I'll pay for that, right?
Yeah.
When you start it off and there's only 10 houses with the cellular access, like it's not something you want to use. Think of a dating site. If there's 10 people on a dating site, you don't want to use it. If there's millions, you do want to use it. This is a classic problem with building networks: is how do you get over this early phase when the network effects are weak?
Yeah.
Right. And so crypto is the perfect complement to that. Crypto is a great way to provide incentives in the early areas of building a network. And it turns out a lot of interesting networks in the world are physical networks. So there's people doing this for, climate weather modeling. There's people doing it for mapping, self-driving data and mapping cars. There's people doing it for, electric car charging, for cellular networking. We just did one that's around energy metric monitoring. And there's people doing sort of, they call it decentralized science, which is sort of you mix it in with sort of more scientific applications. So one way to think, one sort of simple heuristic is anywhere where where you want to build a network and is a challenge to sort of build the early phases of the network, crypto can be a really useful way to help bootstrap that.
Oh, interesting.
Right. And so that's probably it's one of my favorite areas in which the physical, you could keep going on a bunch of different areas, but if I had to pick one, I would say that's one where the physical world and robotics intersecting with and sort of data collection and all these other themes that kind of intersect with AI are relevant.
Mark actually gave me this framework, which I like a lot, which is is the AI frosting or sugar? Which is if the AI
like
is
a core ingredient.
Frosting is a core ingredient. If it's frosting, all the incumbents are going to win because you just slap a chatbot on your existing product and you've got distribution. You have that selling reference power, incumbent relationships. If it's more fundamental of an ingredient, you can't actually just slap AI into the product. You have to build it from scratch, and that favors the newcomers. It's just very TBD. We haven't seen anything that tells us what the answer is. The more steal your thing, the more skeuomorphic, it is, which is early cycle thing, the more it probably favors the incumbents. And
another way maybe to frame Mark's thinking is kind of the Clay Christensen view, where is it disruptive or sustaining? And specifically, I think what people misunderstand about Christensen's view, right, is it's not just disruptive doesn't just mean new. It means misaligned with the incumbent business model.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And so that means that even if the incumbent, that's sort of the interesting part of his book, right, is that even when the smart incumbent sees it coming, it's very, very hard for them to react to it because it's inconsistent because it's not what their best customers are asking for.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so that's where I think maybe that's somewhat overlaps with Mark's frosting icing
thing.
It
could be that the business model is a fundamentally shifted business model.
Yeah. So you come in and you're like, instead of databases, it's some radical new architecture that's database.
Yeah.
I don't know what. It's something that eats up that cannibalizes the incumbent business model and therefore makes it organizationally and economically harder for the incumbents to layer it on.
Yeah.
Right.
We haven't seen it yet. We've seen people talk about outcome-based pricing.
Well, that's the second thing is I think it comes down to I'll get to this in a second, but I think there's a sort of a framework I like to use to think about the stages of how these things roll out. But let's talk quickly about consumer. So in consumer right now, at least, I don't think you see a lot of network effect businesses, right? So
sure.
As successful as these, the Claudes and ChatGPTs are, I don't think they have a network effect. Their switching costs are relative. Maybe they learn your history.
No, we actually thought this was going to be the case. We thought that the killer thing was going to be, okay,
like a data network effect.
They take and they get there's a data network effect. It
So
turns out,
people responding, and then there's a reinforcement learning loop or something.
Well, so yes, and that it turns out the reality is humans are relatively uninteresting.
Oh,
and so there's
you don't learn that much.
Most of the stuff that people are doing, it's not like there's some
data network effects is one of these things we've talked about for 20 years, and it almost never seems to actually be a thing. I don't know.
Yeah, it's certainly not a thing in this case. So. Well, we thought it may be, but it's not.
So the risks to these guys, right? I mean, look, there's also brand. Like ChatGPT has a great brand, and so there's a lot of other kind of intangible.
Persistent memory could be a thing, right? Like that actually,
it learns you. It gets integrated into your life. Maybe integrations. It's like in your calendar. I don't know. Yeah. But the question is, right? How do they avoid in the steady state having just like a model and price competition to the race to the bottom, right? They'll be obviously they're important big businesses, but will they be kind of dominant? You know? And then what is the opportunity for new startups? If you're doing venture investing in AI consumer, like what, you see a lot of these things as like, make your face prettier, like these kind of fun apps, but then they zoom up in the app chart. And then TikTok copies it and so forth, right? Because it's just not, because again, no network effects.
No effect, yeah.
So how, and there's this technique, kind of strategy I like to talk about called come for the tool, stay for the network. And the idea is, maybe you can use that, like make my face prettier, and then sort of use that as a hook to get people into your new network, like your social network, possibly, although it just feels very, very hard today, given the scale and power of these incumbents. So anyway, that's a big interesting, and that, by the way, will intersect back to crypto, because what crypto is, and what I argue in my book, is that crypto is a new way to build networks.
Yeah.
And so, you sort of have the chocolate and peanut butter. You have AI with all these really interesting use cases, and then you have this new kind of technique for building networks. AI, the interesting use cases, but no network effect. And then you have this new thing that's like all network effects, and, are there interesting ways to combine them? But before I get to that, I think it's important to talk about kind of how big technologies kind of roll out in multiple stages. So there's a distinction. It's not my distinction, but I've talked about a lot. It's the sort of one way to think about technologies is that they can do one of two things. They can do old things better, or they can do new things you couldn't do before, right? And so, we call the first one skeuomorphic. This is a Steve Jobs term, which sort of refers to products and designs that kind of harken back to a prior era to make them more understandable. And then there's what we call native apps, which are the kind of new things that couldn't be done before. And then there's actually a third stage, I think, which is kind of second order effects, which is once you create this big new technology, what are the things that now that sort of, you created the car, and now you have the highway system, and now you're able to create suburbs and trucking infrastructure, right? Like those are kind of second order downstream effects. There's a famous line that the great science fiction writers didn't. Good science fiction writers predict the car. Great science fiction writers predict the traffic jam, right? So it's like that idea. So it's like down. Like what are the second order? Bitcoin is something that couldn't have existed before social networking, right? Like 30 years ago, you say someday people are going to have their own media, and you're going to remove these gatekeepers. And then they're going to, who would have thought? Then you're going to create these, digital currencies. There would have
been no way to create the community in them.
Yeah. It would have been a New York Times article saying this is stupid, and then that's the end of it, right? There's nowhere to get together and talk about it and create your own. I mean, they're really they're religious movements, most token communities, and they need places to congregate and discuss it. And so now they have that. And so there's all these kind of second order. I mean, we're seeing effects in politics and all these other things, right? I mean, there's the whole, arguably our society and world is changing as a second order effect of social networking. So one way to think about AI, so the first stage is kind of the skeuomorphic phase, which is you're going to use, this is the stuff you see talked about all the time in the business, startup community of like your, customer service bots, right? So you take a job that's currently done by a person sitting in a call center, and you replace that with a AI voice and, chatbot, right? And you sort of a one-to-one, in the simplest case, it's a one-to-one exchange of, and it's cheaper and it's more systematic, and it will displace jobs. Hopefully it will also create equally or more jobs and better jobs. But that's sort of an obvious first stage. And look, and this is, I think, one of the reasons people get so excited about the opportunity for AI is you can just see that happening in, I don't know, tens of millions of jobs, I guess. Like kind of the whole laptop middle kind of section of the economy, you can see many of those jobs. Including us, who spend their days typing emails.
That's the joke. It's like we can speculate on it, but we're part of that group too.
So that's sort of phase one, right? It's skeuomorphic, but that phase one can last 20 years. So just to be clear, like,
yeah,
and it may just be that's the thing that happens for the next 20 years. And then the next phase is the native phase. And that, to me, that's what gets me more excited. And by the way, let me give a little analogy to the internet. So the skeuomorphic phase was the 90s. And so the 90s, what you had was people, basically, if you look at 90s internet, people were sort of taking offline things like magazines and catalogs and putting them online. So you would go buy things, but it wasn't like something, and it was much easier. You could type in a website and go, buy this rare book on Amazon. And it was much easier and it was convenient, but it was fundamentally something you could have done before. It just would have been clumsy and getting some weird magazine, some catalog or something. But it wasn't until the 2000s that people did things like social networking and these things were just brand new things. There's no analog in the offline world to a lot of these new behaviors that people created. I talk a lot in detail about this in the book if people are interested. But
and a business model that didn't exist.
And a business model and just the whole thing. I mean, just there's a whole bunch. You had very loose analogs like yearbooks and things, but nothing, and that's actually kind of, if you look at early Facebook, it was more like a yearbook. But as it evolved into a news feed and all the other things that happened, it became kind of really a brand new thing that no one had really imagined. And so anyway, so you sort of saw the internet play out that way. And in that case, it took probably 2000, 93 was Mosaic, and 2000, I would say 5-ish was sort of YouTube, and 4, I think, was Facebook or whatever it was. So it took at least a decade.
Yeah.
And so I think, so with AI, there's a really interesting, and by the way, there's one of the things you get in the native phase, which is why it's so exciting, is you get new products, you get new forms of media. So if you go back, when photography was growing in popularity, there were all of these kind of cultural art criticism, think pieces about what will happen to art. The famous, like Walter Benjamin, the Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. There's all these like famous essays where it was like, what's going to happen? Like, because, now that you can take a photo and create a beautiful landscape, what's the role of the artist in that world, right? And so people were kind of worried about it. In the same way they're worried today about generative AI, right? So like, what if you can now, create a movie? It looks like you can pretty soon, right?
Yeah, images is there.
Images is there, and probably videos coming soon. What happened in the case of photography is that you had, I think, kind of two things happen. You had art, like fine art, kind of went more abstract and away from photography, right? They did sort of leaned into what they were unique at. And that's when you had whatever, Cubism and all these other kinds of movements. And then on the other side, I think what's really interesting, right, is you had the rise of film. So you had someone say, hey, yeah, maybe you can use machines to replace photography, but you can also now use machines to create a brand new art form that never could exist before, right? You sort of had it with animation, but now you could do it a really interesting, sophisticated way with film, right? So to me, so film would be what was the native form of media in the age of mechanical reproduction, right?
Oh, that's a fascinating analogy. Yeah.
And so I think today, so the interesting thing, right? So when you look at the generative AI, like the negative way to look at it, and you do see a lot of this negative sentiment from like the art community and things on Twitter, where they say, look, this is just, a cheap replacement for human creativity. That's the negative way to look at it. The positive way to look at it is this is the base layer, in the same way that film was a base layer back then. And now there's this new canvas of human creativity where you can create new art forms. I don't know what those are. They may be virtual worlds or games or new types of films and movies. I don't know, or
they may intersect with a new, way to consume the media altogether. Like
maybe there's new interfaces. And this is to me what's so exciting about the new native media, the native apps, is that I won't think of it because it's going to in my experience through watching some of these waves in the past it really does take kind of brilliant creative people to come up with these new things, and it surprises you in many cases, and so I think that's going to be the exciting phase I'm looking for, is like, what are not how do you just use this technology to do the things you could do today but do them cheaper, but how do you use the technology to push the frontier and do things that could never be done before, in the same way that film did that, right?
Yeah.
I think most people would agree, if you go back and look at it, that, the film, I think photography probably unlocked more opportunities for creative people than it than it removed.
Yeah, than if it had never existed.
And I think this would be the hope in this kind of phase. So there's that, and look, there's that kind of, and there's that's the media example, but there's probably that for consumer applications, and that for social networking, and that for also productivity, and so that will be the really exciting thing I think to see, is not just the replacing things we do today, but come up with brand new behaviors that are things we couldn't do before. And then the third thing is the second order effects, right? So you create this new world. So you've created this world of social networking. It's interesting to think with social networking. We've seen it play out, and it surprised me too. Like, you sort of have social networking rise in the 2000s. I think it hit a tipping point. Maybe the Obama election.
Yeah.
Was that the 2008 and then 12 too? Like he really sort of leaned into using that. And I remember seeing all these news articles like, wow, this is different. People are, the bit had flipped from offline second to online second as a secondary, sort of online was primary. But then we started seeing these kind of weirder things, like I think like the Trump movement and the populism just surprised everybody. And you just started seeing movements and just behavior. And I think we still haven't really figured out what's going on, where all this is headed. And we're in this kind of disequilibrium state, I guess. Anyways, and that probably those sort of second order effects of social media will probably play out for, as I mentioned, like crypto, and I think a bunch of other interesting movements today are second order effects of social media. And then, and that will probably play out for 20, 30 years. And so that will probably be phase 3 of the AI revolution.
Yeah. And just think about the timelines.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably going to take a very long time for all, like, I'm always overly optimistic on these things historically. Like, I'm like, okay, we're done with the skeuomorphic phase of AI. Now we'll do the native phase. But the reality is each phase probably takes a decade.
One of the interesting things you said around these sort of distinct phases, obviously, like the internet took a long time, partially because you had to build a network.
Yeah,
right. Like it was a supply and demand issue, right? Like a physical network, and then also
the wire, the physical, the literally laying cables and then
laying cables. And sure, you have to build large clusters of compute GPUs here with networking, but I think the constraining factor for getting from that skeuomorphic phase to the native phase is not necessarily capabilities themselves, but like human creativity.
Yeah, I think so.
In like
I think the bottleneck will be, I mean, yes, I think the bottleneck here will be humans and policy regulation, which are obviously closely connected.
Yes.
And I think humans on both the supply and the demand side, probably more on the demand side. So meaning supply side, you need to have people come up with all the creative things. But we've got, the world's different now in that I just think the startup world is different now. It's much more mature and much more sophisticated, honestly, than like when I was coming up in it, in the sense that you've got like, I mean, when I was starting off, there were 10 venture firms. Now there's thousands. Like, it's just a much more mature and, the number of startups and honestly, like, there's a lot of good, smart advice out there.
This is a more popular path for smart people to go to.
Yeah, it's like a thing you do, like, in places like Y Combinator and other places have done a good job of this. Like, if you're coming out of a top school, I mean, even 10 years ago, this wasn't, like, I knew people that were like, wow, you could do startups,
Yeah.
I mean, probably 15 years ago, but maybe, definitely that was the case 15 years ago. But now I think it's like an established career path. There's an established set of mentors, established set of funding. There's a canon of pretty good advice out there. Like the standard advice is much better. It used to be terrible advice. Now it's good advice. There's you can come out to San Francisco, and I think relatively easily, if you're smart, like network friendly person, like get embedded pretty quickly. And then Silicon Valley, it's gotten just very good at sort of throwing tons of capital energy against those problems. So there's a supply side. I suspect the demand side is more like meaning like changing organizational and human work and behavior patterns, like getting an organization to take the video example we're talking about. Like how long is it going to take Hollywood to adopt
specific?
Yeah, I mean, look, I wrote my book. I wanted to have my own voice, use AI to read the book using my own voice. Both the publisher and Audible, the podcasting platform, ban AI completely. So, and part of it's unions and just a bunch of resistance and I'm just saying like how.
I think people know this, but like the capabilities are fully there to do that.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Andreessen had a great blog post. It's like, how do I know they're going to ban AI like medicine? Because they already have, essentially. Like if you look at, I mean, essentially, like these things are so heavily regulated, and so many areas where it's going to have an impact are so heavily regulated. And just the organization, like, look, and so take the Hollywood Gen AI thing. Like, you'd have to lay off a whole bunch of people, probably, who you don't want to lay off, who are unionized, and so that means maybe there'll be, some fresh upstarts, maybe in another country, who create, native movie studios, AI native movie studios. But that will take a very long time. There's a lot of, there are a lot of very talented people. The right answer is probably not, the right answer is probably to harness all of that talent in Hollywood and combine it with AI in some way, right? I mean, because there is a lot of very smart people and talent. But how long will that take culturally? It may take a whole new generation to really play out, right? And I think so that's what I mean by the demand side, right? And then just human behavior, changing your workflow, using an AI assistant all the time. I mean, I think, I don't know. Anyway, so.
Yeah, having sort of human, like a co-pilot for everything you do, like it feels like it's.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that can be solved with interfaces and things. I don't know. Then there's the policy side, which is there's going to be, this resistance I'm discussing already is going to be, enshrined. There's going to be movements to enshrine it in law. And, that's going to play out, I think, in multiple levels. It's already starting to play out in the courts. And it's starting to play out in state legislatures with California had the AI bill. You have a bunch of lawsuits around copyright. I think my view is ultimately this will play out in Congress. This is such a big issue when you have something that affects tens of millions of jobs. It is beyond something that people are going to allow just happen through
free markets.
Yeah, and through regular court decisions, like the copyright thing is an example. You can ultimately you could have some judge. It's just right now the question is when an AI system is trained on a piece of data, is it copying that data or is it learning from that data? Yeah, right? It's sort of a philosophical question.
That's a fundamental question across different media happening right now.
That's right. And so, and you could have 5 years from now, some judge, a judge, some federal judge decide that philosophical question, or I think more likely you'll eventually have some legislation, like congressional legislation, that's some kind of compromise struck between the media industries and the tech industries that comes up with a solution that both creates incentives for creators, but also allows AI systems to exist. I don't know. But that thing will play out over a very long time. When will you be allowed to use AI in medical and finance? And I mean, a significant what is it, probably 70% of our economy are regulated industries, right?
Yeah, of course.
On the flip side, the stuff with Waymo is really impressive. I'm surprised they're actually allowed in San Francisco.
Well, it turns out it's 7 to 10 times safer than a human driver, and there's now millions of miles of game film.
So maybe that's the playbook to get this stuff adopted more broadly.
What is an ideal future state of the internet? So there's sort of near zero cost of creation and distribution, transparent ownership, governance. What does this look like?
Yeah, so I think that we're at a crossroads, and there's a real question as to whether it looks more like its original vision, which is the vision of the internet, like the 90s vision and the 80s vision or something, was an internet that was owned by community owned, community governed. The economics, the money mostly flowed to the edges of the network and not to the intermediaries in the middle. Like a very simple thing. Just think about this. Just imagine the network and how the little green dots and how the money's flowing, right? Like originally in the 90s, the money flowed to the edges, to small businesses, to innovators, to entrepreneurs. If you looked at a map today, it's mostly flowing to the middle. This is why these 7
it's $200 billion of revenue. It's all.
Yeah, I think the top 5 internet companies are something like more than half of the market cap, not more. It might be something higher by now. And so just you have all the green stuff kind of flowing into the middle. And so there's sort of I think of it as 2 kind of important things that you want. It's about power and money, right? Control. And my core argument in the book is that those 2 questions are a product of how you build these services. In other words, what architecture you choose. The first sentence of the book is your architecture is your destiny, or something like that. The architecture you choose determines how it's controlled and how the money flows. And I think we're really at a kind of critical point. In fact, I worry we're approaching a point of no return where it's going to be an internet controlled by 5 companies. And what's happened is these networks have all gotten to a certain scale, and they've just decided that the next kind of wave is to keep you trapped there.
Well, there's no way to grow users anymore. They've kind of captured all the users.
That's right. And so they're
get more time.
So they're kicking away the ladder, right? They climb the ladder and they're kicking it away, and it's really negative. And this is why we as a firm have felt that this is such an important topic of being able to build new internet services with new architectures, like using blockchains, is such an important topic for the future of small tech, little tech as we call it, along with open source AI, the other kind of critical thing, which is if a startup has to pay this giant tax to an incumbent to build competitive services, they won't be able to build build services that threaten those incumbents, right? So
yeah, we've seen that before, right? Like you've talked about it as sort of, Singo was built on top of Facebook.
Yeah.
And then like
it's platform risk, right? I mean, we're building on quicksand. Right. So we need startups need access to distribution and networks, and they need access to modern software, open source software. And so I think those are the critical questions. Those will be, I think, a hugely important thing, which is why we've invested so much time and money in it. Is the regulatory side of this, is like what policies are there, and are they policies that encourage competition and innovation in little tech? And then, I think just kind of raising awareness of these topics and having discussions about them are important, so that we don't kind of what I'm worried about now is we're sort of kind of, backing ourselves without having really thought it through into a situation where there's 4 companies that control everything, and it ends up we're kind of eating our seed corn. Like so much of what we benefit from today is the startup innovation of the past, and we risk losing that if we let these small set of companies control everything.
Yeah. Well, I'm optimistic. Look, the bright side is, through all the work that you guys have done in our firm, we've kind of gotten the word out about little tech. And I think understanding that building, a new architecture, new infrastructure, and then the importance of open source, I think the word is getting out. So
yeah, great.
This is awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here. I love talking.